He paid for her in silver coin, counted out cold and deliberate into her father's shaking hands. To her, he was nothing but a scarred, silent stranger who smelled of pine smoke and old leather, a man the whole of the Saskatchewan territory feared without quite knowing why. But she didn't know the truth that had kept him walking back to that same river, crossing every spring for 11 years. She was the only person who had ever been kind to him when kindness cost something. The autumn of 1883 came to the grasslands north of Swift Current like a debt collector, early, humorless, and without mercy. The Holt family's quarter section had been failing slowly for 3 years, the way most things fail. Not all at once, but in small surrenders. First the Eastfield, killed by a late frost. Then the well, gone brackish and undrinkable by midsummer. Then Marguerite Holt's health, which had been declining since the stillbirth the previous winter, crumbling so quietly that her husband Reuben convinced himself each morning that she was only tired. Reuben Holt was not a cruel man. That was the tragedy of it. He was simply a weak one, and in the Northwest Territories in 1883, weakness had the same consequence as cruelty. It just took longer to arrive. His daughter Josephine had turned 22 that September. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's habit of pressing her lips together when she was frightened, as though keeping the fear physically sealed inside. She had spent the better part of that autumn carrying water from the creek a quarter-mile east, stretching their flour with ground cattail root, and pretending to her younger brother Nate that everything would be fine come spring. Nate was 13 and believed her because she had never lied to him about anything important before. The man who arrived at their homestead on a gray Thursday morning in late October was named Callum Greer. Nobody called him that to his face. In Swift Current he was called the Warden, not for any official title, but because he had spent 15 years trapping and ranging the deep country north of the Qu'Appelle Valley, and because he had a way of appearing at the edge of a situation before anyone understood there was a situation to speak of. He was somewhere north of 40, built like something the land itself had assembled from raw materials, wide through the shoulder, weathered dark by exposure, carrying the kind of stillness in his eyes that men who have survived genuine danger tend to carry. A pale scar crossed the ridge of his left cheekbone, the remnant of a fight with a wolverine that most men agreed should have killed him. He rode a blue roan stallion that stood 17 hands, and he arrived in the Holt yard without announcement, which was his custom. Josephine was splitting kindling when she heard the hooves. She straightened, the axe still in her hands, and watched the stranger rein in his horse at the gate. Behind him, straining at a lead rope, came a sturdy pack horse loaded with canvas-wrapped bundles. Her father emerged from the barn, and Josephine saw immediately from the set of Reuben's shoulders that this was not a stranger to him. They had met before, somewhere, and whatever arrangement had been made in that meeting was the reason Callum Greer was here now. The two men spoke low near the fence. Josephine couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She watched her father's hands, the way they moved from his coat pockets to his collar to his hat brim, the way they finally extended and received something that glinted briefly in the thin autumn light. A small leather pouch, drawn tight at the neck, heavy enough to change the angle of his arm when he took it. She felt the floor of her life give way beneath her feet. When her father turned and walked toward her, he was already looking somewhere past her left shoulder, the way people look when they cannot stand what they've decided to do. "Joe," his voice was raw. "Don't." She kept hers very quiet. "It's only for a year," he said. "Don't tell me what he said." Reuben stopped walking. The leather pouch was clutched against his sternum like a wound he was trying to hold closed. "Your mother needs a doctor in Regina. Real medicine, not what Mrs. Dunmore makes from bark and guesswork, and the mortgage note is due the 1st of December. There's nothing left, Josephine. There's nothing." She looked past him at Callum Greer, who had not moved from his horse. He was watching her, not the way Josiah Gentry's kind watched women, not with that particular assessment that made the skin want to crawl away from itself. He was watching her the way a man watches weather, not unkindly, but without illusion. "A year," she said flatly. "He'll bring you back in the spring thaw." He gave his word. She didn't ask what the word of a man called the warden was worth. She put down the axe. She went inside and packed what little she had: 2 wool dresses, her mother's rosary, a tin of charcoal pencils she'd been given as a girl, and a book of Canadian surveying maps she'd had no business acquiring and absolutely no regrets about keeping. She kissed her mother's damp forehead, told Nate she'd write when she could, and walked back outside before the part of her that was sensible could stop her. Callum Greer helped her onto the pack horse without speaking. His grip was brief and impersonal, and he immediately turned his roan north before she had finished settling herself. She did not look back. If she looked back, she would lose what little composure she had, and she had decided, somewhere between the axe and the door, that she would not give the warden the satisfaction of seeing her come apart. They rode 3 days north and east into the rolling spruce country below the boreal tree line, and in that time Callum Greer said fewer than 30 words to her. He pointed out the water crossing ahead so she could brace herself. He told her once, around the second evening fire, that the smoked fish in the canvas bag was for her if she was hungry. He identified a distant movement on a ridge as caribou and not timber wolf, which she had been wondering about with some anxiety and too much pride to ask. On the 3rd day the terrain changed, rising slowly into rockier ground, the spruce giving way to stands of black pine, the sky growing wider and colder. And then they crested a long granite ridge, and the valley below opened up, and Josephine forgot briefly that she was a woman who had been bartered like winter stock. It was extraordinary. An oval lake sat at the center of the valley, dark blue against the pale shore, fed by 2 clear tributaries that cut down from the northern escarpment. The surrounding forest was old growth, cathedral high, the trees so large she could not have circled the trunks with both arms. And nestled against the southern tree line, built in a deep notch in the rock, where it would be sheltered from the prevailing north wind, was a structure that could only barely be called a cabin by someone who had not yet been inside it. It was solidly built. Extraordinarily so. The logs dovetailed at the corners with precision, the chinking between them smooth and uncracked, the roof steeply pitched to shed snow. A woodshed flanked the east wall, already stacked full. A smokehouse stood nearby, and beside it, a small outbuilding that she would later discover was a cold room dug 3 feet into the permafrost, for preserving food through summer as well as winter. She stood in the doorway and took it in. A wide stone fireplace dominated the north wall, already drawing beautifully. A work table ran the full length of the south wall beneath 2 deep-set windows, a sleeping loft accessed by a notched ladder. One chair near the fire, broad-backed, worn smooth by years of use. A second chair, she noted, had recently been added. It was slightly newer. He had built her a chair. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. "The loft is yours," Callum said, adding wood to the fire with the practiced ease of a man who has done it 30,000 times. "There's a bolt on the trapdoor if you feel better having it. I sleep below, near the fire. Always have." He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since the yard. "You're not a prisoner. If you want to walk the perimeter of the valley, walk it. I'll show you where the ice goes thin on the lake so you don't go through it. Traps are marked with orange ribbon. Don't touch them, not because I'm telling you not to, but because they'll break your fingers." "Questions?" "Several
Thousand.
Josephine said, before she could stop herself. Something shifted very slightly at the corner of his mouth. "I imagine." He picked up his coat. "Smoked whitefish in the cold room, biscuits in the tin by the stove. I've got lines to check before dark." He went out. She stood in the center of the cabin alone. The fire ticked warmly. Outside, the wind made a sound like a bow drawn slowly across a very low string. She did not know yet why she was really here. She found out 9 days later, by accident, the way truths that have been kept for a long time tend to surface. Not all at once, but because something small and incidental dislodges them. She had been exploring the cabin systematically, not snooping, she told herself, but orienting. A woman in an unfamiliar place learns it or fears it, and Josephine had always preferred knowledge to fear. The high shelf above the south window held a row of practical objects: oil tins, a spare compass, a folded oilskin, and pushed to the very back, partially hidden behind a block of paraffin wax, was a small wooden box. She should not have opened it. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of clean calfskin, were two items. The first was a child's hair ribbon, faded blue, the kind a girl might wear pinned behind her ear. The second was a folded square of paper, browned at the edges, soft from years of being refolded along the same creases. She unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing, charcoal on cream paper, done by a child's hand but with unusual control. A sketch of a hawk in flight, seen from below, its wings fully extended against a sky suggested by a few economical lines. In the bottom corner, written in the careful block letters of someone who was still learning to write, were two words: "For you." Josephine sat down on the floor of the cabin without deciding to. She was 9 years old again. She was sitting on the bank of the North Saskatchewan, soaked to the waist and shaking, having slipped from the stepping stones at the old Carrot River crossing while her father was speaking to the ferryman. A boy, older, maybe 14, lean and sunburned, and carrying a trapper's pack that was too large for his frame, had waded in without taking off his boots and hauled her out by the arm with a matter-of-fact efficiency that had startled her out of her panic. He'd sat with her on the bank until she stopped shaking. He hadn't made a fuss over it. He'd just sat beside her in his wet boots and waited, the way a person sits with a frightened animal, giving it time to remember that it isn't dying. When she finally stopped crying, she'd done the only thing she could think of, which was to pull her charcoal pencil from her coat pocket and draw him a hawk on the clean inside cover of her surveying pamphlet and tear it out and give it to him. She'd lost the ribbon from her hair in the water, or thought she had, but he'd found it downstream and tied it to his pack strap. He'd been gone when her father came back from the ferry. She had thought about that boy occasionally over the years. The way you think about something that happened before you understood what it meant. She was still sitting on the floor, the drawing in her hands, when the cabin door opened, and Callum came in out of the gray afternoon, his arms full of split wood. He saw her. His eyes dropped to the drawing. He went very still. "That's mine," Josephine said, in a voice she barely recognized. "I drew that. I was 9, at the Carrot River crossing." He set down the wood carefully. He didn't attempt to explain or deny or deflect. He stood in the middle of his own cabin with the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been asked to set it down. "You fell off the stepping stones," he said finally. "You went in with your boots on. I didn't think about it. You found my ribbon." She looked down at the calfskin wrapper. "You kept it, both of them." "4." She stopped, counted the years. "For 11 years. He crossed to the fireplace and crouched to tend the embers, not because they needed tending, but because he needed something to do with his hands. "I came down to Swift Current for supplies in August," he said, his voice low and even. "I saw you outside the land office. I recognized you." He paused. "You tie your hair the same way." She waited. "I heard about your family in the supply store. Heard the mortgage note was coming due and your mother was sick and your father was 3 months out of ideas." He added a log to the fire, not looking at her. "I heard a name. A man out of Regina who'd been asking around about your father's note. A man with a particular kind of interest in young women in difficult circumstances." The fire caught and bloomed. "I couldn't let that happen," Callum said simply. "So I went to your father." Josephine sat with this for a long moment. The drawer of her understanding opened and closed, opened and closed. "You spent everything you had." He shrugged once, a small motion that was not casual at all. "Silver's just weight. Does nobody any good sitting in a tin under a floorboard. You brought me here. Her voice was careful now, testing each word before she set it down. To keep me safe. I brought you here because up here, no Regina banker can find you, and no man with bad intentions can reach you before spring thaw. He finally looked at her, and because I didn't know what else to do. I'm not a man who knows many people. I know this valley. Josephine looked at the drawing in her hands, at the hawk she had drawn at 9 years old, given to a strange boy on a riverbank, carried for 11 years through the deep country of the Northwest Territories, and kept in a box on a high shelf in a cabin at the end of the world. She refolded it along its old creases. She placed it back in the calfskin wrapper. She put it in her coat pocket. I'm going to need more charcoal pencils, she said. Callum Greer looked at her for a moment. I'll add it to the spring list, he said, and went to hang up his coat. The winter that followed was the coldest in 17 years, which everyone north of the 53rd parallel could have predicted, and nobody was glad about. The snow came in November and did not stop for 3 weeks, until the valley was buried under 4 feet of white silence, and the only sound was the deep percussion of the trees cracking in the frost. It should have been unbearable. It wasn't. Callum was a patient and exacting teacher, which surprised her. She had expected curtness, instruction delivered like orders. Instead, he showed her things once, clearly, and then stepped back and let her try without commentary, correcting only what mattered. He showed her how to read animal trails in the snow, the difference between a marten's drag mark and an ermine's. He showed her how to bank a fire to last through a cold night, and how to tell by the color of the smoke whether the wood was burning clean. He showed her, on a crystalline afternoon in December, how to use the old surveying compass she'd found in his kit, patiently tracing her errors on the snow with his finger until she stopped making them. She, in turn, gave him things he didn't know he'd been missing. She began drawing again, first small sketches of the valley from the south window, then studies of the birds that visited the tree line, then, increasingly, Callum himself, caught unaware at the workbench or by the fire. He discovered one of these drawings one evening and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You made me look less grim than I am," he said finally. "I drew what I saw," she said, not looking up from her work. He left the drawing on the workbench where she'd put it. She noticed 2 days later that it had been moved to the mantelpiece. She did not say anything about it. He did not say anything about it. There were by now a great many things they did not say out loud. In late January, on a night when the temperature dropped to 40 below, and the air itself seemed to crystallize, Josephine woke in the loft to a sound she couldn't immediately identify, a low rhythmic creak from the direction of the cold room, followed by a heavy impact that shook the near wall. She was down the ladder before she was fully awake, her feet finding the cold floor by instinct. Callum was already at the door, his rifle in his hand, pulling on his coat one-armed. "Stay here," he said. "No," she said, and pulled her own coat from the peg. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. He handed her the spare rifle from above the door, the repeater he had spent 2 weeks teaching her to use, and they went out together. What they found was not what she had feared. Against the cold room door, having smelled the smoked fish through the ventilation gap, a young black bear had materialized. Not a threat, just an animal doing the most logical thing available to it in a killing cold, which was to try to eat. It had worked one of the door planks loose with remarkable persistence, and was methodically enlarging the gap when Callum fired once into the snow 10 feet in front of it. The bear left, eventually. Callum repaired the door in the dark by lantern light, his breath making clouds in the air. Josephine held the lantern and handed him things, and at some point she realized that this, holding the lantern for someone in the dark, in the cold, in the middle of the night, while the boreal forest pressed silently around them, felt more like home than anything she had experienced in years. She didn't say that. She handed him the mallet. February brought a different kind of crisis. A trapper named Corbett, who worked the territory 2 ridges east, arrived at the valley edge on a gray afternoon leading a frostbitten horse, and in a state of controlled distress. Callum went out to meet him, and Josephine watched from the window as Corbett's posture said everything she needed to know before Callum came back inside. "There are men asking questions in Swift Current," he said. His voice was even, but she had learned to read the stillness around his voice. "About you, and about me." "Regina?" she asked. "A solicitor. Name of Ambrose Vane." He said the name like it tasted bad, representing a land consortium. "He's been talking to your father." The floor of her stomach dropped. "About what?" "About the survey maps." Callum sat down at the work table, his hands flat on the surface. "The ones you had in your pack. The consortium is trying to establish a rail corridor north through the Quapel. To do that legally, they need to challenge every private claim in the survey corridor. Your father holds a registered homestead claim that puts him directly in the path." He looked at her. "And you, as his eldest, are named co-holder on the original filing." "I didn't know that." "I suspect your father knew and said nothing, because if you'd known, you'd have tried to use it, and men like Ambrose Vane don't enjoy negotiating with women who know what they're holding." His jaw shifted. "Vane went to your father, told him the claim was worth contesting, told him to produce you or sign over the co-holder rights by proxy." Josephine was very quiet for a moment. Or he'd have the winter arrangement declared a coerced transaction and me arrested for it." The muscle in Callum's jaw worked once. "He'd have the claim by March either way. He just prefers the paperwork to be clean." She stood up. She walked to the south window and looked out at the frozen lake, the dark tree line, the sky that was the color of pewter and absolutely enormous. She thought about her father's shaking hands. She thought about her mother's cough, the way it rattled deep now, not close to the surface. She thought about Nate at 13, shoveling snow in a yard that was draining the life out of everyone in it. She thought about what a rail corridor would do to a homestead that had a proper legal claim against it. Not nothing was the answer. A properly contested claim against a railway corridor was worth something considerable, if someone who understood surveying maps and land law argued it correctly. "I need paper," she said. Callum looked at her. "What kind? The good kind, and all your survey references from the upper shelf." She turned around. "And someone to take a letter to Swift Current." She spent 4 days writing, which was 4 days of Callum building extra fires and not asking questions, and occasionally setting food beside her elbow without comment. She wrote to 3 people: a land solicitor in Regina, whose name she'd found in an old territorial gazette; a Methodist minister in Swift Current, whom she knew to be scrupulously honest; and a woman named Harriet Price at the Territorial Women's Suffrage Association, whose address she had committed to memory at 17 because she had always suspected she'd need it someday. Corbett took the letters south on a Tuesday. Callum watched him go, and then came back inside and poured them both coffee and sat down across from her. "You know what you're doing?" he asked. "I know land survey law better than Ambrose Vane does," she said. "I've been reading those maps since I was 12. I know exactly where the survey corridor runs and exactly where it doesn't, and there are 200 acres of the Holt claim that fall outside the contested corridor entirely. If that's registered and defended before Vane makes his filing, he has nothing." Callum looked at her across the table. The fire moved quietly in the hearth. "How does a homesteader's daughter know land's survey law?" he asked. "How does a trapper build a dovetailed cabin in the middle of the boreal forest?" she returned. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to it in 8 weeks. "Fair enough," he said. The response from Regina arrived in late March, when the first real thaw was beginning to soften the southern slopes of the valley. It came with Corbett, who arrived looking satisfied in the way people look when they have been entrusted with good news. The land solicitor, a woman, which Josephine had suspected might be the case from the name, a Mrs. Lenora Baird of Baird and Associates, had reviewed the survey documents and agreed entirely with Josephine's analysis. The independent filing had been made. Ambrose Vane's consortium had been formally notified, that the contested claim Flake was legally defended by a co-holder who was very much present and represented. Vane, Mrs. Baird's letter, noted with some satisfaction, had retreated to Regina with considerable speed. Josephine read the letter twice. Then she put it down on the table and sat very still for a moment, feeling something move through her chest that she didn't have a precise word for. "It worked," she said. Callum, reading the second letter from across the table, looked up. He nodded once. "Your mother's being seen by a doctor," he said, "from the minister's letter." Baird arranged a fee waiver through the church health fund. He slid the paper across. "And your brother is apparently helping with the medical supply deliveries and has charmed the entire congregation." Josephine read that letter too. She did not manage to keep her face entirely composed while doing so, but Callum was very occupied with his coffee cup and did not appear to notice. By April the valley was changing. The lake ice broke in long groaning plates, and the tributaries ran fast and clear, and the south-facing slopes bloomed impossibly green in the brief alpine spring. Josephine had stopped counting the days until she was supposed to return to Swift Current. She wasn't sure when she had stopped, only that she had. On an evening in mid-April, she was sitting on the flat rock above the east tributary that she had claimed as her thinking place, watching the water and making notes in the margin of a surveying pamphlet, when she heard him come and sit on the rock below her. They sat like that for a while. The water moved. A pair of mergansers worked the current near the far bank. "I'm supposed to take you back," Callum said, "when the snow clears the pass." "I know." A pause. The mergansers dove in sequence. "The pass cleared 4 days ago," he said. She looked up from the pamphlet. He was looking at the water. "I noticed," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. "I put a second chair in the cabin," he said, "before you came. I didn't think about why I did it until after." Josephine set down the pamphlet. She thought about the drawing of a hawk, carried 11 years in a calfskin wrapper. She thought about a boy who went into a river without taking off his boots. She thought about the way he'd moved her drawing from the workbench to the mantelpiece without saying a word. She thought about the chair. "I'm going to need to go to Swift Current," she said, "to meet with Mrs. Baird in person, and to see my mother, and to file the independent survey claim properly with my own signature." Callum was quiet. "And then," she said, "I would like to come back, if that's—" She stopped. "Tried again. If there's still room." He looked at her then. Something moved behind his eyes that she had never seen there before, and it made him look entirely different and entirely like himself. "There's room," he said. She nodded. She picked up the pamphlet. The mergansers surfaced downstream and shook the water from their heads. They sat together on the rock above the river for another hour, saying almost nothing, which was, she had come to understand, the way Callum Greer said most of the things that mattered to him. She went to Swift Current at the end of April. She sat across a desk from Mrs. Lenora Baird, who was in her 50s, wore her gray hair in a severe chignon, and had the eyes of someone who had spent decades refusing to be underestimated. Josephine signed the claim documents with a steady hand. She visited her mother, who was thin and pale but breathing better, and who held her daughter's face in her hands for a long time without speaking. She talked with Nate, who had grown an inch and a half in the winter, and had very decided opinions about rail corridor legislation that he had apparently developed through the church reading group. She did not tell her father exactly what she had built in the valley above the tree line. She told him only that she was well and that the claim was protected and that she would write. She was back at the valley by the second week of May. She came over the ridge in the late afternoon, the pack horse trailing, and the valley opened below her the way it always did, enormous and still and entirely itself. The lake caught the light. The old spruces stood in their columns. The cabin sat in its notch in the rock, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin blue line. Callum was at the woodshed when she came down the trail. He saw her and put down what he was carrying. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She unloaded the pack horse and brought everything inside. In her pack, alongside the new charcoal pencils she'd bought in Swift Current, 4 boxes, which Callum noted with a look she was beginning to recognize. She had brought Mrs. Baird's formal letter of survey registration, stamped and sealed. She set it on the mantelpiece, under the drawing of a hawk in flight. "The claim's registered," she said. 240 acres of the Holt homestead independently defended. Vane can't touch it. Callum looked at the letter. He looked at the drawing above it. "Good," he said. Outside, the valley was very green in the long northern evening, and the lake moved quietly in the wind, and the world below the tree line felt, as it always would from here, like something that belonged entirely to someone else. Josephine hung up her coat. She sat down in her chair by the fire, the one he had built before she arrived, when he hadn't yet let himself understand why. She opened a new charcoal pencil. She began to draw.